The Invisible Father. Richard Ellison, a name synonymous with success, power, and relentless determination. Born to a humble family, Richard had clawed his way to the top through grit and unwavering ambition. Now in his late 50s, he was the proud owner of Ellison Enterprises, a conglomerate spanning industries from tech to real estate. Yet despite his monumental achievements, Richard's proudest creation was not his empire but his son Daniel. Daniel Ellison had been the light of Richard's life from the moment he was born. Richard had spared no effort or expense in giving Daniel every opportunity a child could dream of: the best schools, the most experienced tutors, and access to the influential circles Richard had worked so hard to penetrate. In his mind, he was paving the way for Daniel to take over the business someday, to continue the legacy he had built from nothing. But as the years passed, Richard began to notice cracks in the foundation of his relationship with his son. Daniel, once a curious and compassionate boy, seemed to transform before Richard's eyes. The humility that had once marked his personality faded, replaced by entitlement and arrogance. He basked in the luxury his father's success provided, yet he seemed uninterested in the effort and sacrifices that had made it all possible. Worse, he treated those beneath him with disdain, as though their worth was measured solely by their wealth or status. One evening, as Richard sat in his expansive study surrounded by accolades and framed memories, an unsettling thought struck him. Had I failed as a father? He had given Daniel everything. But perhaps in doing so, he had deprived him of the most important lesson: the value of hard work and empathy. That night, Richard resolved to uncover the truth about his son. He would test Daniel's character in the most drastic way imaginable. He would shed his identity, his wealth, and his influence to see if Daniel's love for him was genuine or merely transactional. 2 weeks later, Richard executed his plan. He informed his executive team that he would be stepping away indefinitely, citing personal reasons. To maintain his anonymity, he quietly transferred power to his trusted deputy and withdrew a modest amount of cash. Then he packed a single duffel bag, leaving behind his lavish wardrobe for second-hand clothing. With his neatly trimmed beard grown into a scruffy shadow and his tailored suits replaced by frayed jeans and a worn jacket, Richard left the mansion that had been his home for over 2 decades. As the gates closed behind him, he felt a strange mix of trepidation and resolve. For the first time in decades, Richard became invisible. Richard's new life began in the heart of the city he had once ruled from gleaming skyscrapers. The same streets where his name was spoken with awe and respect now treated him as just another homeless man. He spent his days wandering, observing, and blending into the fabric of urban life. At night, he sought refuge in crowded shelters, or curled up on benches, his body aching from the unfamiliar hardness of his new reality. He resisted the urge to contact Daniel, even as the weeks turned into a month. He wanted to see if his son would reach out, notice his absence, or show any concern. But there was nothing. No calls, no texts, not even a cursory inquiry. One evening, while sitting outside a bustling cafe, Richard's heart ached as he overheard snippets of conversations. Executives discussed mergers and acquisitions, topics he once dominated, while young professionals spoke of weekend plans. He felt the sharp pang of being a man who had everything and suddenly had nothing. 2 months into his journey, Richard spotted Daniel for the first time. He was sitting in the back seat of a sleek black car, laughing with friends as they pulled up to a high-end restaurant. Richard's heart leaped at the sight of his son, but it quickly sank as he noticed Daniel's demeanor, casual and carefree, as if the world revolved around him. Daniel's laughter echoed in Richard's ears as the car disappeared into the valet area. Determined to observe Daniel more closely, Richard followed him from a distance over the next few days. He watched as Daniel attended lavish parties, spent hours at exclusive clubs, and dined at the city's finest establishments. But there was no sign of the values Richard had tried to instill in him. Instead, he saw a young man who seemed lost in the trappings of privilege. One day, Richard decided to take a bold step. He would approach Daniel directly, not as a father, but as a stranger in need. Perhaps this would reveal the true nature of his son's heart. Richard waited outside one of Daniel's favorite restaurants, clutching the cardboard sign that read, "Hungry and homeless. Anything helps." The bitter winter wind bit at his face as he stood, his pride warring with his desperation to know the truth. Hours passed before Daniel finally emerged, flanked by friends. They were laughing and joking, oblivious to the world around them. Summoning his courage, Richard stepped forward, extending a trembling hand. "Excuse me, sir," Richard said, his voice raspy and hesitant. "Could you spare some change for food?" Daniel stopped and turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked Richard up and down. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of warmth or empathy. Instead, Daniel's expression hardened. "Sorry, I don't carry cash," he said curtly, his tone dismissive. Without waiting for a response, he brushed past Richard and disappeared into the night. Richard stood frozen on the sidewalk, the sting of his son's indifference cutting deeper than the cold. He had hoped for even a small sign of kindness, a spark of humanity, but Daniel's response confirmed his worst fears. The wealth and privilege Richard had worked so hard to provide had not built Daniel's character. It had eroded it. As Richard trudged back to the shelter that night, he wrestled with a crushing sense of failure. Yet, amid the despair, a new resolve began to form. If his son had lost his way, perhaps there was still a chance to guide him back. But first, Richard needed to understand how to reach him. And for that, he would need to dig deeper into Daniel's world. To Richard, this was no longer just a test. It was a mission, a father's last effort to save his son from a life devoid of purpose and compassion. Shadows of the past. Richard Ellison had always believed in the power of redemption. Though the harsh reality of Daniel's apathy gnawed at his spirit, he refused to give up on his son. Richard knew that wealth and privilege were not inherently corrupting. It was the absence of struggle, the lack of perspective, that warped one's character. Perhaps Daniel's indifference was less about malice and more about ignorance. Determined to uncover the root of the problem, Richard decided to immerse himself further into Daniel's world, to see the people and choices that shaped his son's current path. The following week, Richard found himself sitting at a crowded park bench, scanning the screen of a second-hand smartphone he had purchased with the last of his savings. Using his old corporate connections had felt like cheating, but he justified it as a necessary tool for his mission. Through social media and news articles, he pieced together a timeline of Daniel's activities over the past year. It didn't take long to identify a troubling pattern. Daniel's life revolved around a tight-knit circle of wealthy acquaintances, most of whom shared his entitled attitude. Their social media profiles showcased a lifestyle of excess. Private yacht parties, luxury vacations, and exclusive galas. Yet, beneath the curated images, Richard noticed something else, a hollow repetition, a desperate attempt to mask dissatisfaction with extravagance. One name stood out among Daniel's circle, Brandon Cole. The son of a prominent real estate mogul, Brandon had been Daniel's closest friend since college. Richard remembered Brandon from brief encounters during family events. Even then, the young man's arrogance had been palpable. Now, it seemed Brandon had become a dominant influence in Daniel's life, steering him further into a superficial existence. Richard decided it was time for a more direct approach. He learned from a local news article that Daniel and his friends were hosting a charity gala at the Grand Oak Hotel, one of the city's most exclusive venues. The irony of their so-called charity was not lost on Richard, but he saw an opportunity. If he could get close to Daniel in this environment, perhaps he could find a crack in his son's armor. With no formal invitation, Richard resorted to the skills that had served him in his early days as an entrepreneur: adaptability and quick thinking. Dressed in a borrowed tuxedo from a thrift store, he arrived at the hotel's rear entrance, blending in with the catering staff. "Excuse me, sir," he said to a distracted event coordinator, holding up a tray of champagne flutes he had lifted from the prep area. "Where do you need these?" The coordinator barely glanced at him. "Main ballroom. Make it quick." Richard entered the grand hall unnoticed, weaving through the glittering crowd with practiced ease. The opulence was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers, silk drapes, and an orchestra playing softly in the background. For a moment, he felt like an intruder in his own world. Then he spotted Daniel at the center of the room, surrounded by a group of elegantly dressed young men and women. Brandon stood beside him, gesturing animatedly as he recounted some story that had the group in stitches. As Richard approached, he noticed a waiter being reprimanded by a woman in a designer gown. Her voice was sharp and condescending, drawing the attention of nearby guests. The waiter, a young man barely out of his teens, stammered an apology as the woman continued to berate him for spilling a drop of wine on her sleeve. Richard's heart sank as he saw Daniel glance at the scene, smirk, and turn away without a word. Unable to contain himself, Richard stepped forward. "Excuse me, Mom," he said, his tone calm but firm. "It was an accident. Surely, there's no need for this public spectacle." The woman turned to him, her expression incredulous. "And who are you to lecture me?" Richard's gaze held hers steadily. "Just someone who believes kindness costs nothing." The woman scoffed and stormed off, leaving the waiter to mutter a quiet thank you before retreating. As Richard turned back to the crowd, he realized Daniel was staring at him. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Richard thought he saw a flicker of recognition. But Daniel quickly looked away, returning his attention to Brandon and the others. Later that evening, as the gala wound down, Richard lingered near the exit, hoping for a chance to speak with Daniel alone. His patience was rewarded when he saw his son step outside for a smoke, away from the noise and glamour of the event. "Daniel," Richard called softly, approaching with cautious steps. Daniel turned, his brow furrowing. "Do I know you?" Richard's heart ached at the question, but he steadied himself. "It's me, your father." Daniel's expression shifted, a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "My father," he repeated, then laughed bitterly. "What kind of game is this? My father's missing. And even if he wasn't, he'd never show up looking like—" He gestured vaguely at Richard's threadbare attire. "I've been watching you, Daniel," Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I needed to understand what's happened to you, to us." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his tone turning icy. "If this is some sick stunt to make me feel guilty, it's not working. I don't know who you are, but you've got the wrong person." Before Richard could respond, Daniel flicked his cigarette onto the ground and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the cold. That night, as Richard returned to the shelter, he felt the weight of despair pressing down on him. His son's rejection was a knife to the heart, but it also fueled his determination. He had seen glimpses of humanity in Daniel before. He refused to believe they were gone forever. Perhaps the answers lay not in confronting his son, but in understanding the forces that had shaped him. Richard decided it was time to delve deeper into the shadows of Daniel's life, starting with the people who held the most influence over him. If Brandon Cole was steering his son astray, then Richard would uncover the truth about him. And if Daniel's world was built on a foundation of illusion, Richard would find a way to shatter it, piece by piece. This was no longer just a father's test. It was a battle for his son's soul. The price of influence. Richard Ellison had spent his life dismantling obstacles and solving puzzles. Whether it was a hostile corporate takeover or the complex web of international trade, his sharp mind and unyielding determination had always prevailed. But as he sat on a weathered bench in the dimly lit park that night, the weight of his current challenge pressed on him like never before. This wasn't about profit margins or market strategies. This was about saving his son, Daniel, from a life devoid of purpose, empathy, and love. The first step was clear: uncover the true nature of Brandon Cole's influence. Richard had seen enough to know that Brandon's friendship with Daniel was more than a casual bond. Brandon was a puppet master, pulling the strings that kept Daniel ensnared in a world of superficiality. If Richard was to reach his son, he needed to expose Brandon for who he truly was. The next day, Richard began his investigation. Armed with nothing but a second-hand smartphone and the determination that had once fueled his rise to power, he delved into Brandon's life. Public records, news articles, and social media profiles painted a picture of a man who thrived on excess and manipulation. Brandon was the heir to a real estate fortune, but had never earned a dime of his wealth. His Instagram was a gallery of indulgence, private jets, exotic vacations, and expensive liquor. But beneath the glossy veneer, Richard sensed a darker reality. Through an old contact in the real estate world, Richard learned of several failed business ventures Brandon had spearheaded. Each one had ended in disaster, leaving a trail of bankruptcies and unpaid debts. Yet Brandon always emerged unscathed, his reputation intact, thanks to his father's influence and money. It became clear to Richard that Brandon wasn't just a bad influence on Daniel. He was a parasite, feeding off those around him. Richard's next move was risky but necessary. He decided to infiltrate Brandon's inner circle. It wasn't difficult to find out where Brandon would be. That weekend, he was hosting a private poker game at a penthouse suite downtown. The event was invite-only, but Richard had a plan. Dressed in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, Richard arrived at the luxurious building, blending in with the evening's crowd. Outside the penthouse door, he approached one of the catering staff. "Excuse me," he said, his tone firm but polite. "I'm filling in for one of your servers who couldn't make it. Can you tell me where to set up?" The staff member hesitated but ultimately nodded, too busy to question him further. Richard entered the suite, carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres as his cover. The room was a spectacle of wealth. Crystal chandeliers, plush furnishings, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. Brandon sat at the center of it all, surrounded by a mix of socialites and sycophants, including Daniel. Richard's heart clenched as he saw his son laughing at some crude joke Brandon had made. Daniel looked relaxed, carefree even, but there was something hollow in his laughter. It wasn't the genuine joy Richard remembered from his childhood. It was a performance, a mask. As the night went on, Richard moved quietly through the room, observing the dynamics at play. Brandon was the undisputed leader, commanding attention with his charisma and brash confidence. Daniel, by contrast, seemed content to follow, his actions dictated by Brandon's cues. Whenever Brandon made a sarcastic comment, Daniel laughed the loudest. Whenever Brandon dismissed someone, Daniel followed suit. It was as though his son had traded his identity for acceptance. But what struck Richard most was the undercurrent of fear among the group. Brandon's charm was a double-edged sword. Those who basked in his favor one moment could find themselves humiliated the next. Richard watched as Brandon berated one of the players for folding too soon in a hand of poker, his voice dripping with disdain. The man laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the humiliation was clear. Richard realized that Brandon's influence over Daniel wasn't just about friendship, it was about control. Brandon thrived on power, and Daniel was just another pawn in his game. Toward the end of the night, Richard saw his opportunity. While Brandon was distracted, boasting about his latest investment to a small group, Richard approached Daniel, who had stepped away to pour himself a drink. "Daniel," Richard said quietly, keeping his voice low. Daniel turned, his brow furrowing. "You again." Richard stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "I'm not here to embarrass you. I just want to talk." Daniel sighed, glancing around to ensure no one was watching. "Look, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I'm not interested." "It's not a scam," Richard said, his voice steady. "It's me, your father." Daniel's eyes flickered with something. Anger, perhaps, or maybe fear. "My father's gone," he said coldly. "And even if he wasn't, he wouldn't show up at a place like this looking like." He gestured vaguely at Richard's attire. Richard's heart ached, but he refused to back down. "Daniel, I've been watching you. I've seen the life you're living, the people you're surrounding yourself with. Is this really who you want to be? Daniel's jaw tightened. You don't know anything about my life, so why don't you save the lecture and leave me alone? Before Richard could respond, Brandon's voice cut through the tension. Everything okay over here, Daniel? Both men turned to see Brandon approaching, his expression one of amused curiosity. Richard's presence had not gone unnoticed. Yeah, everything's fine, Daniel said quickly, stepping away from Richard. Just some guy who thinks he knows me. Brandon smirked, looking Richard up and down. You lost, old man. Or are you here to audition for our charity case of the week? The room erupted in laughter, and Richard felt his face flush with humiliation. But as he looked at Daniel, hoping for some sign of discomfort, he saw only indifference. That night, as Richard walked back to the shelter, his heart felt heavier than ever. His son had become a stranger, molded by a toxic environment, and the influence of a man who thrived on manipulation. But Richard wasn't ready to give up. If anything, the encounter had strengthened his resolve. He needed a new strategy, one that would force Daniel to confront the truth about himself and the people around him. And to do that, Richard would have to expose Brandon Cole for the fraud he truly was, not just to Daniel, but to everyone. Exposing the puppeteer. Richard Ellison knew that confronting Brandon Cole head-on would require more than determination. It would require strategy, precision, and an understanding of his enemy's vulnerabilities. Brandon wasn't just a bad influence. He was a master manipulator, a man who thrived on controlling others to inflate his own sense of importance. If Richard was to free Daniel from Brandon's grasp, he would need to expose Brandon's true nature, not only to Daniel but to the entire social circle that kept Brandon's ego afloat. Richard spent the next week gathering information. He began by frequenting the high-end bars and lounges Brandon was known to frequent. It didn't take long to piece together a pattern. Brandon was always the center of attention, but his charm had sharp edges. Bartenders whispered about his condescending remarks. Waitstaff rolled their eyes at his excessive demands. Even some of his supposed friends admitted, after a drink or two, that Brandon was the kind of man who would throw anyone under the bus to save himself. But Richard needed more than hearsay. He needed proof. Something undeniable that would shatter the illusion Brandon had built around himself. The breakthrough came one evening when Richard, sitting quietly at a corner table in an exclusive lounge, overheard a heated conversation. Two men, dressed in tailored suits, were arguing about a failed investment scheme. Brandon promised it was a sure thing. One of them said, his voice tight with frustration, "Now we're out $500,000, and he's pretending it never happened." "Typical Brandon," the other replied. "He's all talk. You know he's just using his father's name to cover his messes, right? The guy couldn't manage a lemonade stand without screwing it up." Richard's pulse quickened. This was exactly the kind of leverage he needed. Quietly, he approached the men after their conversation ended. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "I couldn't help but overhear. I might be able to help you hold Brandon accountable." The men looked him up and down, skepticism evident on their faces. "And who are you?" one of them asked. "Just someone who's tired of watching him get away with it," Richard replied. "If you're willing to share the details, I can make sure the right people find out." After some hesitation, the men agreed. They handed over documents and emails showing Brandon's involvement in the failed scheme. The evidence was damning. Brandon had not only lied about the investment's potential, but had also pocketed a significant portion of the funds for himself. With the evidence in hand, Richard turned his attention to the upcoming charity auction, an event Brandon was co-hosting with Daniel. The auction was the perfect stage for Richard's plan. It would be attended by some of the most influential figures in the city, many of whom were already wary of Brandon's reputation. If Richard could reveal the truth there, Brandon's facade would crumble, and Daniel would see his friend for who he truly was. On the night of the auction, Richard arrived early, blending in with the staff as he had before. This time, he carried a small briefcase containing copies of the evidence he had gathered. His goal was not just to confront Brandon, but to ensure that everyone in attendance knew the truth. As the evening progressed, Richard watched from the sidelines as Brandon worked the room, schmoozing with guests and basking in their admiration. Daniel followed closely, his laughter echoing through the hall as he played the role of Brandon's loyal sidekick. Richard's heart ached at the sight, but he steeled himself. This was the moment he had been preparing for. When the auction began, Richard seized his chance. As the first item was brought to the stage, he stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting through the chatter. "I apologize for the interruption, but there's something you all need to know before this evening continues." The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. Brandon's expression shifted from confusion to annoyance as he realized who was speaking. "What is this?" Brandon demanded, stepping forward. "Who let you in here?" Richard ignored him, addressing the audience instead. "Many of you know Brandon Cole as a charming and successful businessman, but the truth is far less flattering." He opened the briefcase, pulling out copies of the documents. These are records of a fraudulent investment scheme orchestrated by Brandon. He promised returns he couldn't deliver, stole funds, and left others to clean up the mess. And this isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Richard handed the documents to a nearby journalist. Brandon's face turned red with fury. "This is ridiculous," Brandon sputtered. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I think the evidence speaks for itself," Richard replied calmly. "And if anyone doubts its authenticity, I invite you to verify it. The details are all there." Daniel, who had been standing to the side, looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. He stared at Brandon, then at Richard, his expression a mix of shock and betrayal. "Is it true?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Brandon hesitated, his confidence faltering. "Of course not," he said, but the cracks in his facade were evident. "This is just some desperate stunt by a crazy old man." But the damage was done. Guests began murmuring among themselves, some pulling out their phones to search for corroborating information. The journalist who had received the documents was already making calls, his expression grim. As the crowd began to turn against Brandon, Richard stepped closer to Daniel. "Son," he said softly, "I didn't do this to embarrass you. I did it to open your eyes. This is the man you've been following. Is this really who you want to be?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked at Brandon, who was now arguing with several guests, his charm replaced by desperation. Then he looked at Richard, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "I need time to think," Daniel said finally, his voice strained. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the hall, leaving Richard standing alone. That night, as Richard returned to the shelter, he felt a glimmer of hope. The confrontation hadn't gone perfectly, but it had planted a seed of doubt in Daniel's mind. For the first time in years, there was a chance, however small, that his son might begin to see the truth. But Richard knew the battle was far from over. Brandon might have been exposed, but Daniel's journey towards self-discovery was just beginning. And as a father, Richard was prepared to walk that path with him, no matter how long it took. Seeds of reflection. Daniel Ellison sat alone in his penthouse, the sprawling view of the city below doing little to calm the storm in his mind. The events of the charity auction played on a loop in his head, the man who had claimed to be his father, the damning evidence against Brandon, the whispers and stares of the crowd as he walked away. For the first time in years, Daniel felt untethered, unsure of the world he had built around himself. Brandon Cole, his closest friend, had been the cornerstone of his social life. But now, Daniel couldn't shake the doubt that had taken root. Could the accusations be true? Was Brandon's charm just a mask hiding something far uglier? And the man who had confronted them, that disheveled stranger who claimed to be his father, was there a grain of truth in his words? Daniel poured himself a drink, staring into the amber liquid as though it held answers. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken to his father. Richard Ellison had always been a larger-than-life figure, a man who commanded respect and exuded confidence. But he had also been distant, consumed by work and the endless demands of running a global empire. When Richard disappeared, Daniel had told himself he didn't care. But now, a part of him wondered if that indifference had been a lie. The next morning, Daniel decided to confront the doubts gnawing at him. He started by reaching out to a mutual friend who had attended the auction. "What do you think about what happened last night?" Daniel asked casually, trying to mask the turmoil in his voice. The friend hesitated before answering. "Honestly, I've always thought Brandon was a little too slick. That guy your father, or whoever he was, might have been onto something. I mean, I've heard rumors before, but seeing the documents, it's hard to ignore." Daniel's stomach churned. The doubts grew louder, demanding his attention. But he wasn't ready to confront Brandon directly. Instead, he decided to investigate on his own. Over the next few days, Daniel combed through every piece of information he could find about Brandon. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Failed investments, lawsuits quietly settled, and a trail of broken partnerships. It all pointed to a man who was far from the reliable friend Brandon had claimed to be. But it wasn't just Brandon's actions that troubled Daniel. It was his own complicity. How many times had he ignored red flags, laughed at Brandon's cruel jokes, or followed his lead without question? The realization was sobering. For years, Daniel had let himself be swept along by the current of his friend's charisma, never stopping to ask where it was taking him. As Daniel grappled with these revelations, Richard was fighting his own battles. Back at the shelter, he reflected on the confrontation at the auction. It had been a gamble, and while it had shaken Brandon's facade, it hadn't been enough to reach Daniel. Still, Richard refused to give up. He knew his son well enough to recognize the cracks forming in his carefully constructed world. All he needed was a way to widen them. One evening, Richard received an unexpected opportunity. A young woman named Clara, who volunteered at the shelter, struck up a conversation with him. She had seen him at the auction and recognized his face from old news articles about Ellison Enterprises. "You're Richard Ellison, aren't you?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and respect. Richard hesitated but nodded. "I am, or at least I used to be." Clara's eyes lit up. "You don't remember me, but you funded a scholarship program years ago. I was one of the recipients. That scholarship changed my life." Her words stirred something in Richard, a reminder of the man he had once been, a man who believed in building a better future for others. Inspired by Clara's story, Richard devised a new plan. If he couldn't reach Daniel through direct confrontation, perhaps he could remind him of the values he had once admired in his father. The following week, Richard began volunteering at a community center in a rundown part of the city. He spent his days helping organize food drives, mentoring at-risk youth, and repairing the center's aging facilities. Word of his involvement spread, and soon, his efforts caught the attention of local news outlets. One evening, a reporter approached him for an interview. "Mr. Ellison, why are you doing this?" she asked. Richard smiled faintly. "Because somewhere along the way, I forgot what really mattered. I'm trying to remember." The article that followed painted a picture of a man seeking redemption, a billionaire-turned-volunteer who was rediscovering the power of community. The story went viral, eventually making its way to Daniel's inbox. Daniel read the article twice, his emotions a tangled mess of confusion, anger, and curiosity. The man described in the piece was so far removed from the father, he remembered that it felt almost surreal. But the seed of doubt planted at the auction had taken root, and Daniel couldn't ignore it any longer. If there was even a chance that the man in the article was truly his father, he needed to find out for himself. That weekend, Daniel drove to the community center. As he parked his sleek sports car in the gravel lot, he felt a pang of discomfort. The building was modest, its paint peeling and its windows cracked. It was a far cry from the luxurious venues he was used to. Inside, he found Richard sweeping the floor of a small gymnasium. For a moment, Daniel froze, unsure of what to say. Then Richard looked up, and their eyes met. This time, there was no dismissal, no cold indifference. Instead, there was a glimmer of something Daniel couldn't quite place. Hope, perhaps, or forgiveness. "Daniel," Richard said softly, setting down the broom. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice shaky. "I read the article. Is it true? Are you really doing all this?" Richard nodded. "It's true. But more importantly, it's necessary. For me. And maybe for you too." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted. "Everything I thought I believed in. It feels fake." Richard stepped closer, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Then maybe it's time to find out. And you don't have to do it alone." For the first time in years, Daniel felt the faintest glimmer of hope. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. A legacy reclaimed. The days following Daniel's visit to the community center marked a turning point for both father and son. The long-standing wall of estrangement between them, built by years of misunderstanding and neglect, had started to crack. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself questioning not only his relationship with his father, but the very foundation of his own life. Richard, on the other hand, felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. He knew the road to rebuilding their bond would be long and fraught with challenges, but Daniel's willingness to reach out was the first step. Now, Richard's mission was clear: to help his son find purpose and, in the process, help himself rediscover the meaning of the life he had built. A week after their initial meeting, Daniel returned to the community center. This time, he didn't come as an observer. He arrived in casual clothes, a rare sight for someone so accustomed to tailored suits and designer brands, and asked how he could help. Richard assigned him the task of organizing donated supplies, a far cry from the luxurious boardrooms Daniel was used to, but a grounding experience nonetheless. As Daniel worked alongside volunteers, many of whom had faced hardships he could scarcely imagine, he began to see the world through a different lens. He listened to their stories: a single mother struggling to make ends meet, a former veteran rebuilding his life after years on the streets, a young girl striving to excel in school despite living in a shelter. These were people who had nothing but gave everything they could to their community. Their resilience and determination humbled Daniel, forcing him to confront the stark contrast between their struggles and his own privileged existence. One afternoon, Daniel approached his father as they sorted boxes of canned goods in the center's storage room. "How did you do it?" he asked, his voice tinged with both admiration and regret. "Build all of this and still lose yourself along the way." Richard paused, his hands resting on a stack of boxes. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he admitted. "I thought if I gave you everything I never had, it would make up for the time I couldn't spend with you. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that what you needed most wasn't money or privilege. It was me." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think I started resenting you because I felt like you were trying to buy my love. And the worst part is, I let myself become the kind of person who could be bought." Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's never too late to change, Daniel. The man you were yesterday doesn't have to define the man you are tomorrow." The transformation didn't happen overnight. Daniel continued to volunteer at the community center, gradually taking on more responsibility. He helped organize a fundraiser that brought in enough money to repair the center's crumbling roof, and he started mentoring local teenagers, sharing his experiences to help them navigate their own challenges. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of fulfillment that had nothing to do with material success. Meanwhile, Richard began to re-engage with the business world, but with a new perspective. He contacted his old deputy, who had been managing Ellison Enterprises in his absence, and proposed a series of initiatives aimed at corporate social responsibility. Under Richard's guidance, the company launched programs to provide scholarships for underprivileged youth, fund affordable housing projects, and support local small businesses. Richard was determined to ensure that his legacy would be about more than just profit. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel and Richard found themselves sitting on the steps of the community center, sharing a quiet moment after a long day. "Do you remember the treehouse you built me when I was a kid?" Daniel asked suddenly, a small smile playing on his lips. Richard chuckled. "How could I forget? You insisted it needed a secret escape hatch." Daniel laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "It was the only place I ever felt like I had your full attention. I think that's why I spent so much time up there." Richard's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of regret. "I'm sorry I didn't give you more of that, but I want to make up for it now, if you'll let me." Daniel nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and determination. "I think we're both making up for lost time." The final test of their renewed bond came in the form of Brandon Cole. Word of Daniel's involvement at the community center had spread, and it wasn't long before Brandon reached out, attempting to reassert his influence. But when Brandon showed up unannounced at the center one afternoon, Daniel met him with a calm but resolute demeanor. "You've got some nerve," Brandon said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Running around with these people like some kind of saint. This isn't you, Daniel." Daniel crossed his arms, his voice steady. "You don't know who I am, Brandon. And honestly, I'm not sure I ever knew who you were, but I know one thing. I don't need you in my life." Brandon's smirk faltered. "Don't be stupid. You think these people are going to get you anywhere. They can't offer you anything." "They've already given me more than you ever did," Daniel replied. "They've shown me what it means to care about something bigger than myself. I'm done with the games, Brandon. You should be too." For a moment, Brandon looked as though he might argue, but then he simply turned and walked away, leaving Daniel to feel a sense of liberation he hadn't known was possible. Months later, the community center hosted its annual gala, a modest but heartfelt celebration of the year's accomplishments. Richard and Daniel stood side by side, addressing the crowd as partners, not just as father and son. "This journey hasn't been easy," Richard said, his voice steady but emotional. "But it's shown me that it's never too late to make things right. We all have the power to change, to build a legacy we can be proud of. And for me, that legacy starts here, with all of you." As the crowd erupted into applause, Daniel glanced at his father, a genuine smile lighting up his face. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they would walk it together, one step at a time.